Dear listeners, it's Jennifer Ahumada on the microphone, your storyteller in the Kitchener-Waterloo region, journalist and marketing strategist. Welcome to the On the Table podcast. This podcast was created for everyone who wants to learn about communications and marketing. Copyrights are protected. Hello people! Welcome to our first episode. In this episode, On the Table, we will discuss assertive and inclusive communication in the workplace and daily life. For this, we have a special guest, Joseph Levesque. Joseph is from Calgary. He is the Senior Communication and Marketing Manager at the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion. He has more than 15 years of experience in communications. He has worked with various Canadian companies such as the Government of Canada and the Bank of Montreal. So let's start opening to the microphone to our guest, Joseph Levesque. Welcome, Joseph, to our first episode about On the Table podcast. How are you today?
I'm well. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jennifer. Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
Perfect, Joseph. So, we want to listen to your thoughts and also share your experience with us about the communication field. But today we want to discuss about assertive and inclusive communication in the workplace and in our personal life. So the first question will be, we can start talking about what is assertive communication.
For me, the best definition of assertive communication comes from Maria Daniela Pipa and Mohammed Jaradat, and they describe the assertive communication as the ability to speak and interact in a manner that considers and respects the rights and opinions of others, while also standing up for your rights, needs, and personal boundaries. So for me, assertive communication is about standing within your power and expressing what you need without disrespecting other people's needs. So if you take everybody's needs into consideration, but still stand within what you believe is right and firm, that to me is what assertive communications is.
Perfect. And knowing this, can you give us an example from your position at CCDI of how you have managed communicate assertively with your team?
Let's see. An example I can think of is that I recently had a meeting with a leadership team member where we were discussing a new logo, and they had very strong opinions about it, and they kept pushing their ideas as though they were fact. So for example, they didn't like the color. One of the colors in it, they don't like the color purple. So they thought that purple should not be included in the logo. And as such, they were really trying to push that. And I kept trying to remind them that their opinions about the color purple have no bearing on what the logo's about, and just kept trying to assert that this actually was a very good version of the logo and that we were going to try and keep going with it because the only reason they didn't like it is because they didn't like that color. So I also, there's also another way that you have to communicate the needs of what's going on. So for example, I had to remind them that we had time constraints, that there were budgetary constraints. We couldn't keep just going back to the vendor and asking for new things because they had already provided so many things, and that we didn't want to change them just because they didn't like certain things about it. So that's one way I can think of that I've tried to communicate assertively about within the workplace.
That is an excellent example in the workplace. And now talking about the topic of inclusion, which is extremely important nowadays. What is inclusion?
Okay, so I feel like we can't talk about inclusion without talking about diversity first. So to me, diversity is about the individual and all of the unique dimensions and qualities and characteristics that we all possess. So for example, you are a woman, you wear glasses, you are from a Latin American country, I'm from Canada, I'm a man. So those are things that make us unique and individual, and those can be a lot of different things. Those can be things that are visible and invisible. Then when we take that, so that's about all the unique qualities about a person. So inclusion is about the collective and creating a culture that strives for equity and values the differences that we all bring to the table. But it's about bringing all of those things to the table. So it's about embracing the unique qualities of others, the diversity that each person brings, I've also heard people say diversity and inclusion in this way, and that is that diversity is a fact. So it's a fact that we all have these possessive qualities, but inclusion is a choice, and inclusion is about bringing all those things together, and we can choose to do those things.
That is good to know. The last part that you mentioned about inclusion is a choice. So what do you think that is important to have inclusive communication in the workplace and also in our daily life?
Seems really obvious to say it this way, so I apologize if it feels really obvious, but inclusive language makes sure that everyone feels like they belong. So that's really important in the workplace, especially. In our lives, it's also important in our daily lives. It's important to make people feel like they belong, especially if you're in a community, for example. We want to make sure that people feel like they belong in a community. So, for example, if I'm giving a talk to a group of people and I say, hey guys, how's everybody doing today? That may mean that I'm excluding people who don't identify as guys. So if I say that, I might be alienating or excluding people who are women or who are gender neutral or who don't think of themselves as guys. That seems a really petty, small detail, but to me, I think it's important for a larger conversation. And if we could start reframing how we think, we can help promote healthy workplace cultures where people can feel engaged and bring their whole selves to work. It also helps foster respectful relationships. So if I'm working with someone and we have very different points of view, if we have inclusive communications, I can respect that person's point of view. And then if I use assertive communication, I can stand within what I believe is right and let them know what I think is the truth.
So knowing this also, Joseph, from your experience, you have a lot of experience, professional experience. So have you worked with companies that have been managed assertive and inclusive communication? And if not, how do you feel when you experience a communication barrier in many ways?
So I feel very fortunate to work in an organization that fosters this type of communication style. CCDI works really hard at building bridges, at opening ways of thinking, and sort of embracing things that one might not always do, might not always embrace. So I'm very, very grateful to be working in this kind of a space. And I have indeed worked for organizations in the past that haven't always been inclusive in their communications. So for example, in the mid-90s, when I was working for oil companies in Calgary, I would get communications where people would talk about, bring your wife or bring your girlfriend and do all of these things. But as a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community, I felt really sort of ostracized and put on the outside of what this was meant to be, an invitation to bring your family and friends. But because they communicated in such a way that it was about wives and girlfriends, I didn't feel included. And that can be really challenging. It can be really off-putting. It can also create a space where people have to make personal decisions that they may not be prepared to do. So for example, if I wasn't comfortable being an out man, I would have to then come out in the workplace. And if someone said to me, well, bring your wife, and I'd have to say, well, I don't have a wife, I'm actually gay, I have a boyfriend or I have a husband. That's a whole other level of communication that I have to make just based on the assumptions that they made about me. So for me, that was one of the slight barriers that I've experienced in the past.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Joseph. Actually, in Latin America, in this case, Colombia, I think that we have many communication barrier and in different ways, and we are not too much inclusion in that part. And sometimes it's difficult in Latin America to manage that kind of things. So in Canada, I think that is a good country in many ways that we feel maybe more open in many sense. And we can feel like this organization, CCDI, that is good to know that they always has been like encouraged to be more inclusive in the workplace. So knowing about Latin American, I want to to touch a point that I don't know, maybe how do you feel with that? But as we are in a country in Canada that has opened the door to the immigration. Many international students like me, we arrive daily, and even other people come here in the refugee. By the way, we know how is the media. So do you think that the media, newspaper, magazines have managed assertive and inclusive communications when promoting Canada? What I mean, I want to be more specific in this question, and it's about the media wants to open the doors with all the people around the world, or do you think that they have something more, not too much inclusive? I know that is a strong question, but how do you see this?
I would say there are different levels of communication when it comes to the media. You have internal media organizations within the country, such as the CBC or the Toronto Star, the National Post, things like that, that are responsible to Canadians, and they report to Canadians. There are also media that is external, that sort of is like a promotional type things, come to Canada. But those things I would find that those things are less a media thing and more of an organizational thing. So to me, the government of Canada, let's say, would put out documents to foreign lands, letting them know about immigration opportunities. So to me, there's two different sides to this kind of conversation. I think that communications that go to other countries to let them know about Canada are very inclusive because they promote what Canada's about, which is about a sort of mosaic, as I think they usually call it, as opposed to, let's say, a melting pot, which is what the United States is, where you are meant to absolve yourself of all your unique qualities so that you could become like everybody else within that country. I think Canada does a very good job at letting people know that if they come here, they could still be who they are. They can still express their values. Now, there are certain things that they have to adhere to. You can't come here and, let's say, treat children poorly. You can't come here and treat animals poorly, or women, or other people. You have to be respectful, and there are certain guidelines in that sense. But I think they do a very good job of promoting Canada as a good place to visit, as a good place to live. Now, I do think that there are some mainstream media organizations that do a really good job to focus on the immigrant experience in Canada. We have here Canadian Immigrant, which is one good newspaper. They talk about the various things that immigrants face when they come here. And there's also a news station called New Canadian Media, which I really like. They focus in on more community type things, which I find is really useful and important. It's sort of expressing what it's like to be an immigrant in Canada and the challenges that people face. These newspaper organizations do a really good job at having sort of inclusive language. I find that assertive language is more of a day-to-day type thing. We don't usually talk about assertive language when it comes to the media, unless it's an opinion piece. So if I'm writing an editorial, I will express my points of view. I will then maybe bring in some other points of view so we can have a conversation about it. But it's not necessarily written in a way to go, at least in my experience, to go, this is the way it should be. You just need to deal with whatever it is that we're telling you.
I completely agree with you. Actually, when I choose Canada for the country that I want to study abroad and try to build my life, it was because the media and government has been doing an amazing job promoting Canada. They know very well how to reach to people. The other question is, Joseph, as Canadian, what do you think that is the best way to help foreigners who struggle with the language to communicate assertively? Can you give me an example, please?
So I think the most important thing is to remind that person that language is a journey. I myself am a native English speaker who is still learning when it comes to inclusive and assertive communication. I learn every day. I learn something new about what could be considered not inclusive communication. I've sent out emails where someone's written me back and said, oh, well, this was kind of not inclusive. And I'd be like, oh, okay. So even someone who has the experience that I have is learning. And I would remind any foreigner or any person learning English as second language to remember that they need to be kind to themselves, that they will make mistakes, and they just need to learn from them and don't make those mistakes again. So I'm trying to think of a good example where I don't have a concrete example, but the ones that come to mind are when people, so we have employees in our organization that have come from other lands. So for example, I have a coordinator on my team, she's from China. So English is her second language, and there are times where she will use a word and I will go, can you explain what you mean by that? And then when she explains it, I can then say to her, oh, well, just so you know, this is what you actually said. What you want to say is this. So I think that that's one example. Another example, I guess, to think of in terms of inclusive language is sometimes people come with their biases from whatever country they're coming from. So, for example, where you're from, it's a gendered language. And so a lot of your thinking could have some gendered thinking to it. So I've had to sort of express to people on my teams that while this is a way that you've communicated in the past, here is how we communicate here. And this is how we want to make sure that we have a more inclusive understanding, an inclusive way of making people feel like they are part of the discussion, like they are invited to be a part of what's going on in the organization.
Thank you for that. Actually, I will get that that advice because it's true. And to finish with the podcast, what do you think that society needs to avoid confusion when we are speaking, and what tips could be the key to overcome this situation?
So for me, I would think there are a couple things that I would say. Never make any assumptions. Never make any kind of assumption when you're talking to anybody. Now, we can make certain assumptions. If I'm writing something in English, the assumption is that you speak English and you understand what I'm saying. But you always need to keep an open mind. There are people out there who think completely differently than you, and more often than not, you need to work with them. You need to live with them in society, and you have to try and find a way to build bridges. This can be especially challenging when it comes to people who aren't willing to have inclusive communications or inclusive dialogues. So that can be where we run into some challenges. But I think if we remember, one of the things that I try and do when I have any kind of communication, verbal, oral, or written, is that I have to remember that everybody has a lived experience that is unique and that they have an opinion based on that lived experience. And so I would say that you would want to try and be as open and available to those new ways of thinking, but also remember that you too have a lived experience and you have an opinion based on that lived experience, and you have every right to hold that opinion and express it, so long as it's in a respectful way and keeps things free and open. I think you'll be in a good shape when it comes to that kind of communication.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for that. Great to share with us your experience in communication and inclusive communication. So this was On the Table podcast. See you in the next episode.
Thanks for having me.